Welcome back to Rock, Shovels, and Manuscripts. I'm pretty excited about today's topic. A few months back, some ladies from the congregation handed me this DVD. You've got to watch this, Steve. And I looked at the title, and it said something like, The Temple Mount isn't really the Temple Mount. And I just rolled my eyes, and I was like, oh, yeah, everybody's coming up with some new theory nowadays. I'm not really interested. I thought it was some sort of hack, and I just didn't care. They said, no, this is really well done. You got to read it or look at it. So I sighed and rolled my eyes. I said, okay, I'll take a look at it. And I was surprised. It was very well done. It was educational. It was informative. And the guy made some good points. Unfortunately, I can't remember his name offhand. But even though I thought it was well done and the man made some very good points, I wasn't convinced. And so I decided to think on the topic a little better and present to you 7 reasons why I think the Temple Mount is still the Temple Mount. Now, 7 reasons, there's more, but 7's a good round number. So I'll just go through those with you, and then if you stumble across this data, you'll also get to think of these 7 things. All right, 7 reasons why I think the Temple Mount is still the Temple Mount. The first one is the location of the Mikvahot. Those are the baptism pools. They're found right below the southern steps. The southern steps lead up to, they're walled off now, but you can see the outlines of some of them, the major entrance to the Temple Mount. So you have this massive set of steps. Here you're seeing just a portion of them. And then up above is the entrance to the Temple Mount. So right there are all these baptism pools, lots and lots and lots of baptism pools. You can see them. They run off into the distance of the hill right there. And the question is, if this isn't the Temple Mount, why are all these ceremonial cleansing pools here? The theory is that the Temple Mount is much further down, way by the Gihon Spring, by the city of David, on a hill that's no longer there. Supposedly it has been razed. But I think this is a significant question. If that wasn't the Temple Mount, then the idea is you had to go up to these Mikvahot and then walk back down much further away and go to the other supposed Temple Mount. It just doesn't make sense. This would be the place where the Temple Mount would be, right next to the Mikvahot. Another argument that the Temple Mount, the current Temple Mount, really is the Temple Mount is the size of the Temple Mount. So when I say Temple Mount and I don't explain other Temple Mount, I mean the one that everybody says is the Temple Mount, the one that has the Dome of the Rock on it and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and millions of visitors visit every year. It's huge. It's like 40 acres. The theory is that it's actually the Antonia Fortress. Now let me explain to you what's going on here. Because of the propensity of the Jewish people to rebel against the Romans, they built, or at least expanded, a fortress that abutted the Temple Mount. And the man in the video, he said, there's no room for the massive amount of soldiers that would have been there anywhere but on what's today called the Temple Mount. So his theory is that the Temple Mount today was simply the fortress for the Roman soldiers. It was their encampment, as it were. But I've got a problem with that for many reasons. The Temple Mount is 40 acres. It used to be 20 acres, so it was doubled in size. They had to virtually make an artificial mountain to encompass it. It was one of the biggest building projects in the world, and it was extremely impressive. In fact, one of the world's largest stones in any building anywhere is at the foundation of those walls. So think about this with me for a second. The temple is somewhere else, according to this theory, and they needed a place to put the Roman soldiers. If you were Roman, would you find a mountain and invest in the biggest building project known, double the size of the mountain, just to put a bunch of conscripts? Nobody would do that. They'd kick people out of houses, they'd tear down some buildings, they'd put them off to the side. I don't think they'd build a mountain and then put a bunch of Roman soldiers there. Third reason, the sounding of the Shofar Stone. Let me read to you from Mark chapter 13. Then as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, See what manner of stones and what buildings are here. And Yeshua answered and said to him, Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. When you visit Jerusalem today, at the wall of the Temple Mount, they show you heaps of stones. You can see them here on the screen. They're there for tourists to see. These are where the stones were found when the archaeologists excavated. They just wanted us to see exactly what they found. This whole area was covered in dirt and built over. So when the archaeologists started excavating, they found these piles of stones. It matches up beautifully with what Yeshua said. In fact, you can even see the pavement underneath, the sidewalk, crushed by these fallen stones. One of the stones they found in that area was the Shofar Stone, which you saw just a moment ago, this one here. And it says on here, to the place of the blowing of the trumpet. So it's a directional sign that was built into the wall that told people where the shofar was blown. Why would the shofar blow stone be found right at the base of where the Antonia Fortress was? But if it was part of the Temple Mount area, that makes sense. They pushed it over with the other stones, like Yeshua prophesied. Not one stone would be left upon another that would not be thrown down. So the location of this Shofar Stone is the third piece of evidence that I'm using to show that the Temple Mount really is the Temple Mount. First is the location of the Mikvahot, the ceremonial baptism pools. The second is the size of the Temple Mount. And the third one is the sounding of the Shofar Stone. And that brings us to the fourth argument. The argument was made several times throughout the video. It seemed to be one of their main arguments, that Yeshua said not one stone would be left standing upon another that would not be thrown down. And then they'll show you the Wailing Wall as an example and say the wall is still standing. So Yeshua's prophecy wasn't fulfilled if this was the Temple Mount. But they made a very basic and a very simple mistake. Everybody knows that the Wailing Wall and those surrounding Western Wall is not part of the temple. Nobody ever thought it was. Nobody says it was today. So to make the argument that that wall is still standing when Yeshua said all the stones of the temple would be thrown down, that's a bad argument because it's based on a premise that nobody accepts. The Wailing Wall and that entire Western Wall, it was a retaining wall. Remember, I told you the Temple Mount was doubled in size. It went from 20 acres to 40 acres. In order to do that, they had to put up a retaining wall. You know what a retaining wall is. It holds back dirt, like you can see on the screen. This would be an example of a retaining wall, so that you could put down a street or a sidewalk or terrace a piece of property. When the Temple Mount was expanded, Herod had to put in a bunch of dirt and columns and arches, and this was the retaining wall. So Yeshua's statement that the temple would be thrown down and not one stone would be left standing was fulfilled. There is not one stone left standing of that temple. In fact, even the wall on top of the retaining wall was thrown down. Those piles of stones that you saw earlier, those are examples of the stones that were actually thrown down. So that argument, which was key to the video, just made me scratch my head and thought, wow, I thought the other arguments he presented were better. All right, the fifth argument why I think the Temple Mount is actually the Temple Mount would be the Eastern Gate. There was only one gate to the Eastern Wall to access the Temple Mount, according to historical records, and the current wall still only has one gate. In fact, one archaeologist said that that gate is built upon the gate that either Solomon built or the one that Nehemiah built when he rebuilt the walls. It's believed to be in the exact same location. It doesn't make sense that if that was the Antonia Fortress, that there'd only be one gate on the eastern side. I've got some video footage of me walking along that that wall, the eastern side, and as I'm heading, I'm trying to think of my directions here, south. The eastern wall is on my right, the Mount of Olives is on my left. You notice it's all bumpy. This is not professional camera work here. This is me with my cell phone. And I'm just trying to show you what the general area looks like. Off to the left there, that's the Mount of Olives. It's a cemetery in the foreground. You're looking near the Garden of Gethsemane right there and that Orthodox church. And if you pan over to the right, this is the eastern wall. You'll notice I'm showing you a good portion of the wall. Right there, there's actually a seam that shows the wall was expanded. So you've got two different parts of the wall right there. And then, as you go further off to the left, as you're looking at this wall right here, you only see one gate, and that's the eastern gate. I'm zooming in here so you can look at the various type of stones. Pretty much in the center of the screen right there, you see a stone that looks like it's framed in a stone. Those embossed stones are Herodian stones. So in that whole view you see right there, only a couple of those stones are from King Herod's day. Walls have been destroyed, the walls have been rebuilt, and they took pieces of stones that they found here and there and put them back. Some of those go to the days of the first century. When I mentioned the Herodian, King Herod, he was the king that ruled when Jesus was born. He's the one that sent the soldiers to kill the babies. He's the one that expanded, or at least started the expansion of that Temple Mount and the rebuilding of the temple. That project continued after his death. So, the theory is that the current Temple Mount is not the Temple Mount. It was the Antonia Fortress. The Antonia Fortress is where the troops were stationed in case there was insurrection starting at the Temple Mount. They could immediately access and put it down. Yes, they needed a lot of area to house those Roman soldiers. But I've given you several reasons why I don't believe it's the Antonia Fortress. I believe it's the actual Temple Mount like everybody says. The first reason I gave you, the location of the Mikvahot. There are ceremonial baptism pools right there below the southern steps. The southern steps lead right to the entrances of the Temple Mount. It doesn't make any sense that all those ceremonial bathing pools would have been put at the base of the Antonia Fortress and then far away from the Temple Mount. The second argument I gave you is the size of the Temple Mount. It doesn't make sense at all that you would build an artificial mountain. You take a real mountain that's 20 acres large and double it to 40 acres, a massive undertaking. In fact, one of the foundation stones is the biggest building stone in the world. You wouldn't go through all that effort just to build up an encampment for Roman soldiers. It doesn't make any sense at all. So the size of the Temple Mount and all the effort it took to build it is my second argument that it's for the temple and not simply an army encampment. The third argument I gave you, that the Temple Mount is the Temple Mount, is the sounding of the Shofar Stone that was found. Yeshua said not one stone would be left upon another. They would all be thrown down. That pile of stones has been found, and a Shofar Stone has been found there too. I've got more arguments and reasons to give you after the break. I hope you'll stay with me. See you in a moment.
GLC invites you to visit us on our Facebook page at facebook.com/GLCTV. Here you can stay in touch with all of the latest GLC news along with daily scriptural inspirations, current specials in our bookstore, links to our newest shows, and online media, plus articles from trusted sources. Feel free to drop us a message or a question by posting to our page. Please help us out and like our page by clicking on the thumbs up button. Don't delay, drop by the GLC Facebook page at facebook.com/GLCTV. We want to interact with you today.
Welcome back to Rock, Shovels, and Manuscripts. I've been working with this theory that's gotten a lot of attention lately, that the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is not actually the Temple Mount, that the Temple Mount was built further south, closer to the Gihon Spring over near the city of David. One of the reasons that's such a promising theory is then the actual next temple doesn't have to be put there. Problem is, the rabbinic authorities believe the Temple Mount is the Temple Mount and they won't build it anywhere else. And I think they're right. I think the Temple Mount is the Temple Mount, and I have 7 reasons that I think that. There are more, but I'm sharing with you 7. On the other side of the break, I already covered them. Let me recap them, and then I'll finish up with my list. The first argument I gave you was the location of the Mikvahot. That is, the ceremonial baptism pools are right there by the southern steps, the entrance to the Temple Mount. If the Temple Mount was somewhere else, all of those ceremonial baths, why would they be there? They should be right up against the temple, and that's exactly where they were. Second argument I gave you was the size of the Temple Mount. The original hill was about 20 acres. Herod doubled it. You wouldn't do that for an army encampment. And that's the theory, that the current Temple Mount was actually the Antonia Fortress where all the Roman soldiers were stationed. But you wouldn't double the size of a mountain to put a bunch of Roman soldiers. There's too much work, too much effort. You would do it for a temple. The third argument I gave you was the finding of the sounding of the Shofar Stone. Yeshua said all the stones of the temple, he said not one would be left standing upon another. They'd all be cast down. The archaeologists dug and they actually found stones pushed over, big heaps of stones from the top of the Temple Mount, just like Yeshua prophesied. And one of the stones said, in Hebrew, it was a directional sign to the blowing of the shofar. Why would you have a directional sign at the Antonia Fortress that talks about the blowing of the shofar? Doesn't make sense. We know from historical records that the blowing of the shofar occurred at the temple. So that the finding of that stone was significant. The fourth argument I gave you, which I told you was against their main argument. Their main argument seemed to be that Yeshua's prophecy specifically said not one stone would be left standing on another. And then they show us the Wailing Wall, and they show us, see, the stones are still standing. There's a couple problems with that argument. One I gave you on the other side of the break, and one I'll give you now. The one I gave you on the other side of the break was that Yeshua was talking about the temple. This is the retaining wall. Nobody thinks that's part of the temple. So it's a bad argument all the way around. It'd be like saying my house was totally destroyed by fire. And then you go to my house and you see the wall around my house. You say, what are you talking about? It's still there. It wasn't my house. It's the wall around my house. And the other argument is even the Wailing Wall itself was destroyed. If you look at the stones, only a fraction of those are Herodian stones. It's been rebuilt. So the argument is just no good. The fifth argument I gave you was the Eastern Gate. Historical records tell us that there was one Eastern Gate to the Temple Mount, and to this very day, there is still only one Eastern Gate on the Temple Mount. It's walled off, but you can see it, access from the Mount of Olives. Doesn't make sense that the Antonia Fortress would have had entrances everywhere else except for on the eastern side. Temple Mount was said to have entrances everywhere else except for the eastern side, which had one. The sixth argument, this is new data, is the water supply. The argument that the man on the DVD gave was the current Temple Mount could not have been the Temple Mount because there was not enough water there for the sacrificial system. So he proposes it was closer to the Gaian Spring. You might know of the Gaian Spring by Hezekiah's Tunnel. That waterway, its headwaters are the Gaian Spring. So his theory is you needed a lot of water. That's the only water source in the region. Therefore, that had to be where the temple was. Several problems with that argument. The first of which is, even if the temple was closer to the Gaian Spring, the temple was still up high on top of a mountain, a hill. The Gaian Spring was low. You still got to get the water up to the top of the hill. And if you have the technology to get it to the top of the hill here, you have the technology to get it to the top of the hill here. So it's not really a good argument, in my opinion. Not only that, but recently they discovered the pools of Bethesda right next to the current Temple Mount. So there was a huge water supply available right next to the Temple Mount. Another reason that argument is no good. And a third reason that argument is no good, I'm going to show you some pictures of the aqueduct. Archaeologists know that King Solomon built an aqueduct all the way that went through the hills of Bethlehem. It was like 12 kilometers long. And they have pictures of the pools of Solomon where some of that water gathered up. They have pictures of where the aqueduct actually empties out in the Temple Mount today. You can see little holes in the ground and stuff, and they know that goes all the way to the aqueduct. So as far back as the original temple, there was a water supply through the hills of Bethlehem, 12 kilometers away, that came to the temple. That water supply would have still been there in the days of Herod. So the argument that it had to be built right over the Gaian Spring doesn't hold water. All right. The seventh reason I don't think the current Temple Mount theory that it was somewhere else is right is because of the Soreg warning stone. This is a very famous stone. A couple of them have been found, and this one was found by the Lion's Gate. The Lion's Gate is right near the Temple Mount. So if it was found by the Lion's Gate, you know this stone was right near the Temple Mount. And it's extremely important when you hear the words on the stone. It says this: no foreigner may enter within the balustrade, the enclosed courtyard, around the sanctuary and the enclosure. Whoever is caught, on himself shall he put blame for the death which will ensue. The temple was divided. It was a house of prayer for all nations. Anybody could go there. The outer courtyard was where the non-Jews were permitted to go and pray. And then there was a little wall. And at the entrance, it was a gate. At the entrance, through that gate, there were these signs. I don't remember how many of them were. History tells us. I'm just going to say a dozen. I don't know. So there's this wall, and to get through the wall, you had to go through the gate, just a little open walkway. And right next to the gate was one of those stones. And the stone basically said, if you're not a Jew, you may not pass this point. If you do pass this point, your life is in your own hands. In other words, it's the death penalty to pass this point. They found one of those warning stones right there in that area. If it had been further away, that's where the warning stone would have been found. Now, this concept of the sanctity of the temple and the idea that if a Gentile went into the temple, he could die, is beautifully illustrated in Acts chapter 21. In Acts chapter 21, the Apostle Paul has come back from his journeys. Remember, he's an observant Jew. But word had gotten out that he was telling Jews everywhere not to be Jews anymore and telling the converts that they didn't have to follow Judaism and that he was against the law of Moses. And the elders advised him to show that these accusations are baseless. Take a vow. And we've got some other guys you can take with you, pay for their vow, and go to the temple and worship, and everybody will see you honor the tradition of the elders, that you follow Judaism, that you've taken a vow, and that you worship in the temple. Paul thought that was a great idea. So he took these guys, and they went to the temple. Well, somebody there saw Paul and knew it was Paul, and either lied or assumed that those guys with Paul were Gentiles. Oh, these are some of the Gentiles that Paul's been ministering to. Well, they were past the gate. So a riot ensued. Their life was in their hands. This is all mentioned in Acts chapter 21, so much so that the Romans had to come and rescue Paul because they were going to kill him on the spot. Just like the sword stone warned. He violated the sanctity of the temple. He brought Gentiles into the courtyard. They were going to kill him. So the Romans, who would have been in the Antonia fortress, came and rescued him. And Paul said, may I speak to the people? And he said, sure. So he started to speak to them in Hebrew, which amazed everybody because they really didn't know that he was a Jewish guy up until this point. I mean, some of the people knew, but not all of them knew. But when he started teaching them in Hebrew, they knew. Well, he talked to them for a while. They listened for a while, but then he said some things they didn't want to hear. They got upset, and they were going to attack him again. At this point, the Roman centurion grabbed him and escorted him off to the Antonia fortress to keep him safe. He then heard about a conspiracy. They were going to send people to kill Paul while he was in custody. When the centurion heard about this, by night he gathered a contingency of soldiers and sent Paul in custody to Caesarea. Why Caesarea? Because that was the seat of the Roman government. The centurion said, hey, man, this is too much for me. I don't know how to deal with this. This guy's caused a riot. A bunch of Jews are going to assassinate him. They said, this Jesus guy is alive. They said he's dead. He wrote all this in a letter, which is seen in the Bible. He said, basically, you deal with it. You guys in Caesarea, you deal with it. So the governor there, I think, was Felix. He read the letter, and he asked Paul, what's going on? So Paul explained to him and shared the gospel with him. The guy said, yeah, this is very interesting. Go away. Let me think on this. Paul was imprisoned in Caesarea. And the very spot where he was imprisoned is visited by tourists to this day. Paul was in prison for a couple of years there. They just wouldn't let him go, even though they had no evidence against him. They kept listening to him, hoping he would pay off a bribe so they could release him, but he wouldn't. And he had the opportunity to testify before Jewish dignitaries and high elevated politicians. The end result was Paul said, you know what? You've kept me in prison illegally. Now you want to send me back to Jerusalem, which they did, to be tried, even though he knew people were going to kill him on the way to Jerusalem. So he said, I'm a Roman citizen. You know I'm a Roman citizen. I appeal to Caesar. Every Roman citizen had the right to appeal to Caesar. So the governor said, you've appealed to Caesar you will go. So they put him on a ship and they sent him off to Rome. And you read in the book of Acts that during this voyage, they were shipwrecked. Everybody on the ship almost died. From the time of Caesarea through the time in Rome, he wrote a bunch of letters. In fact, much of the New Testament that he wrote was written while he was imprisoned in Caesarea and on his journey to and his imprisonment in Rome. All of that because of the violation of the Soreg. So I gave you 7 arguments that I think are quite solid that the Temple Mount is actually the Temple Mount. Should you see the DVD or read the book? Sure, go ahead. Just keep in mind these arguments and that there are several others. The location of the Mikvahot, the size of the Temple Mount, the sounding of the Shofar Stone, the argument that one stone would not be left upon another, it was fulfilled, the location of the Eastern Gate, along with the historical records that say it's the Eastern Gate, the water supply, which is answered through the Aqueduct of Solomon, and then the Soreg Stone. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Rocks, Shovels, and Manuscripts. Please join us again next week. I've got a lot more to share with you. But before I let you go, I want to draw your attention to the screen. Get in touch with us. Order some of the DVDs. Make donations to God's Learning Channel. We love you. May God richly bless you. See you next time on Rocks, Shovels, and Manuscripts.
Order your copy of this program from the GLC bookstore by calling the numbers or visiting the website on your screen. Please include the program number when ordering.